For nearly 2 centuries, one of the richest regions on Earth grew steadily poorer, not because of natural disaster, incompetence, or lack of effort, but through a quiet, legal, and meticulously organized financial process that transferred vast wealth outward while leaving behind hunger, debt, and institutional fragility. And the most unsettling part is that this transfer did not rely primarily on violence or theft in the crude sense, but on contracts, accounting rules, currency mechanisms, and incentives that appeared normal to those benefiting from them. So normal that for a long time, even many victims struggled to fully see it happening. Because the system did not announce itself as exploitation, it presented itself as order, stability, and progress. And by the time the consequences became undeniable, the mechanisms were so deeply embedded that reversing them seemed almost impossible. Which is why the story of how Britain drained India's wealth is not simply a tale of empire and conquest, but a case study in how economic power can hollow out a society while preserving the illusion of legitimacy. And to understand how this happened, it is necessary to begin not with conquest, but with context. Because before British dominance, the Indian subcontinent was not an economic backwater, but one of the world's central engines of production, accounting for a significant share of global manufacturing output, exporting textiles, steel, spices, and agricultural goods across Asia, Africa, and Europe, with complex internal markets, skilled artisans, and regional financial systems that had evolved over centuries. And when European trading companies first arrived, they came not as rulers but as supplicants, trading silver for goods they could not produce at home. Because Britain in the 17th century had little that India needed, and what it wanted most from India, especially fine cotton textiles, required payment in bullion, leading to a persistent outflow of silver from Britain to India, something British merchants and officials openly complained about, seeing it as a drain on their own economy. And this early imbalance is crucial because it reveals the original problem Britain sought to solve, not how to develop India, but how to stop paying it. And the solution did not come through better trade terms or mutual growth, but through political control, beginning with the East India Company's gradual transformation from merchant to sovereign power, especially after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which did not immediately dismantle Indian production or markets, but did something far more consequential. It gave the company the authority to collect revenue. And with that authority came the ability to fundamentally alter the flow of money. Because once the company controlled taxation, it no longer needed to bring silver to India to buy goods. It could use Indian tax revenue to purchase Indian products, export them, and sell them abroad, keeping the profits overseas. A mechanism that British economists of the time euphemistically described as the drain, though the word hardly captures the scale or permanence of what was occurring. Because this was not a one-time extraction, but a continuous siphoning year after year, in which wealth generated in India was systematically redirected to Britain without equivalent compensation. And unlike earlier empires that extracted tribute through visible coercion, this system relied on accounting entries, remittances, and budgetary arrangements that appeared lawful and routine, even as they steadily weakened the economic base of the colony. And one of the most important of these mechanisms was the so-called home charges, expenses that India was required to pay to Britain for services ostensibly rendered on its behalf, including pensions for retired British officials, interest on debts raised in London, salaries of British administrators, military costs for imperial defense, and payments for railways and infrastructure financed by British capital. And on paper, these looked like normal administrative expenses, but in practice, they functioned as guaranteed transfers of Indian revenue to Britain, denominated in sterling, which meant India had to export goods simply to earn the foreign exchange needed to meet these obligations, regardless of domestic needs or conditions, creating a structural pressure to prioritize exports over local consumption, even during times of scarcity. And this pressure was compounded by the transformation of India's fiscal system, because under company rule and later crown rule, land revenue became the primary source of income, extracted through rigid systems like the permanent settlement, which fixed tax obligations at high levels regardless of harvest conditions, effectively shifting risk entirely onto peasants. And while the stated goal was efficiency and predictability, the real incentive was revenue stability for the colonial state, which needed reliable income to fund its remittances abroad. And when crops failed or prices collapsed, the tax demands did not adjust downward, leading to widespread indebtedness, land loss, and forced sales, which further concentrated land in the hands of intermediaries whose primary role was revenue extraction rather than productive investment. And this fiscal rigidity is key to understanding why famines became more frequent and deadly under British rule. Because while droughts and crop failures had occurred for centuries, earlier systems often included mechanisms for relief, storage, and tax remission, whereas the colonial system prioritized budget balance and export earnings over human survival, leading to situations where grain continued to be exported even as millions starved, not because officials were uniformly cruel, but because the incentives embedded in the system rewarded fiscal discipline and punished deviation. And this reveals a deeper psychological dimension of the drain, because it operated not only through laws but also through beliefs, particularly the belief that markets, if left undisturbed, would allocate resources efficiently, and that state intervention, especially for relief, was unnecessary or even harmful, would create dependency or distort incentives. Ideas that were gaining prominence in Britain during the 19th century and were applied with particular rigidity in India, where the consequences were abstracted by distance and bureaucracy. And alongside fiscal extraction, deindustrialization played a critical role in draining wealth. Because Britain did not merely extract revenue, it restructured India's economy to serve British industrial interests, most notably by dismantling India's textile industry, which had once dominated global markets. And this was not achieved through a single policy, but through a combination of trade barriers, tariffs, and industrial competition. Because while Indian textiles faced high duties entering Britain, British manufactured cloth entered India with little or no tariff protection, under the logic of free trade, a logic that Britain embraced only after its own industries were sufficiently developed. And the result was predictable. Indian handloom weavers could not compete with mechanized British mills, leading to mass unemployment, skill erosion, and a collapse of urban artisanal economies, which in turn pushed displaced workers into agriculture, increasing pressure on land and depressing rural wages, creating a surplus labor pool that further reduced bargaining power. And this shift was often framed as modernization, a necessary transition from traditional crafts to agriculture and raw material production. But the critical detail is that India was not industrializing in parallel. It was being locked into a role as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods, a classic colonial pattern that ensured value addition occurred elsewhere, and the profits from that value addition accrued to British capital, British workers, and the British state, while India bore the environmental and social costs of extraction. And this pattern extended beyond textiles to commodities like indigo, tea, coffee, and opium, crops often cultivated under coercive or semi-coercive arrangements that prioritized export earnings over food security, with peasants forced to grow cash crops on terms that left them vulnerable to price fluctuations and debt. And the opium trade is particularly revealing, because it illustrates how Indian resources were used not only to enrich Britain directly, but to solve Britain's trade problems elsewhere, specifically with China, where Britain faced a trade deficit due to its appetite for tea and silk. And by forcing opium cultivation in India and exporting it to China, Britain generated the silver needed to pay for Chinese goods, effectively using India as a buffer to balance its global accounts, with devastating consequences for Chinese society and no corresponding benefit for India, which absorbed the social costs of production without retaining the profits. And throughout all of this, the colonial state presented itself as neutral, even benevolent, emphasizing law, order, and infrastructure, particularly railways, which are often cited as evidence of British investment in India. But a closer look reveals that railways were designed primarily to facilitate extraction, connecting resource-rich interiors to ports, enabling faster movement of troops and goods, and financed through guarantees that ensured British investors received fixed returns paid from Indian revenues regardless of profitability, meaning the financial risk was borne by Indian taxpayers while the gains flowed to Britain. a pattern repeated across multiple sectors, creating what economists later described as a one-way transfer, where capital flowed out while liabilities remained. And this constant outward flow had profound macroeconomic consequences because it reduced domestic savings, limited capital formation, and constrained the ability of Indian entrepreneurs to invest in industry or infrastructure, trapping the economy in a low-growth equilibrium. And British officials often argued that India was too poor to industrialize, ignoring the fact that this poverty was itself a product of extraction, creating a circular justification that reinforced the status quo. And this is where economic psychology becomes central, because the drain was sustained not only by power, but by narratives. Narratives of civilizing missions, of efficient administration, of market rationality, which allowed individuals within the system to see themselves as impartial actors, even as the aggregate outcome was deeply unequal. And Indian critics of the time, most notably Dadabhai Naoroji, articulated the drain theory with remarkable clarity, calculating the scale of wealth transfer and arguing that India was being impoverished not by internal failings, but by external extraction. Yet these arguments were often dismissed in Britain as exaggerated or emotional because they challenged the moral self-image of the empire. And this resistance to acknowledging harm is another recurring pattern in economic history, where beneficiaries of a system struggle to recognize its costs to others, especially when those costs are diffuse, delayed, or geographically distant. And as the 19th century progressed into the 20th, the cumulative effects of the drain became increasingly visible in stagnant incomes, recurrent famines, low life expectancy, and minimal industrial capacity, leaving India ill-prepared to cope with global shocks like the Great Depression, which further reduced export earnings while fixed obligations to Britain remained, intensifying the squeeze. And during World War I and World War II, India's resources were mobilized extensively for the imperial war effort, with forced loans, requisitions, and inflation eroding living standards, while post-war reconstruction in Britain benefited from accumulated imperial transfers, illustrating how the drain did not end with the formal transfer of power, but left enduring legacies. Because when India gained independence in 1947, it inherited an economy structurally oriented toward extraction, with limited capital, weak industry, and deep social inequalities, constraints that shaped its development trajectory for decades. And while it would be simplistic to attribute all of India's post-independence challenges to colonialism alone, it would be equally misleading to ignore how profoundly the drain shaped the starting conditions. Because economic systems are path-dependent, and the choices made under empire narrowed the range of options available afterward. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this history is how ordinary and procedural the drain was, how it relied on budgets, tariffs, exchange rates, and legal frameworks, rather than overt plunder, making it harder to see and easier to justify. And this is why the story matters beyond its historical specifics, because it reveals how power can operate through incentives rather than force, how wealth can be transferred without appearing stolen, and how suffering can be produced as an unintended consequence of systems designed to benefit elsewhere. And when viewed through this lens, the draining of India's wealth is not an anomaly, but an early, large-scale example of a broader phenomenon in global economic history, where asymmetries in power allow some regions to externalize costs while internalizing gains, leaving behind legacies that persist long after the original structures have disappeared. And the uncomfortable realization is that such systems rarely announce themselves as unjust in real time. They present themselves as normal, rational, and even beneficial. And it is only in hindsight, when the cumulative effects are laid bare, that the full extent of the transfer becomes clear, raising a question that lingers not as an accusation, but as a warning about how many other drains, less visible but equally consequential, may still be operating under the surface of what we call the global economy today.